Good afternoon. Welcome to our first live Q&A session. Great to see so many of you join us here today. I'm Alex Hawkins, Director of HR Services at EPM, and I'm joined here today by colleagues from our partner organisations, which include Avec, Southalls and Medigold. We all know, especially after last night's announcements from Boris, that we're in an ever-changing landscape. In the start of this new academic year, we've wanted to give you the opportunity to ask our expert panel any of your burning questions, and so that we could be supporting you as much as possible. I know you've been reaching out to our advisory team who've been inundated with questions, and I hope you found the support helpful through this period, but I thought this would be a useful opportunity to be sharing questions and answers on some common themes that many of you are asking. Hopefully you'll find this support helpful. If you've got any questions, please can you be on the right hand side, you'll see a box where you can post your questions through this session. I hope you're able to answer them, but if we don't manage to get time to answer all of them today, then we will follow up with you directly afterwards. So don't worry if we don't get to it during this hour's session. Thank you to those of you as well in advance who have submitted questions to us. We've tried to cover off as many of those as possible, but again, if there's any that we don't pick up in the session, again, we'll be in contact with you afterwards. So our first question is in regards to pay and absence, which I know our advisory team at EPM have experienced lots of these questions from our customers. We are seeing an increasing number of staff members needing to remain off work because their child is having to isolate. Where do we stand with regards to pay? In a lot of cases, this will fall under the carers policy, which in schools usually only allows for up to a maximum of 5 days with pay, but that will vary dependent on the policy. But how are other schools approaching this? Now I'm going to pass this question first of all over to Richard, who will, as a member of EPM, who will be able to be answering this question.
Hi Alex, and welcome to everybody. It's really good to have the opportunity to speak with you. This is a really common issue. This is going to keep on cropping up because government guidance in terms of self-isolation suggests that wherever somebody has got somebody in their household who experiences COVID-like symptoms, that they should isolate for up to a 14-day period or until test results show that the person in the household is clear of the disease. So we are going to see lots of questions like this. Well, the legal position is basically this, that employees have a right to take unpaid time off to make arrangements for the care of a dependent, and this is likely to take place in emergency circumstances. This is going to be deemed to be an emergency, and therefore there is going to be at the very least a statutory right to unpaid time off. Now you may well have within your own policies, within carers policies, an entitlement to take paid time off, and that should be exercised, that should be allowed in these sorts of cases. Typically there will be some limitations on periods. It might be 3 days, 5 days, and there may be a fixed period in a year that somebody can work to, and once that has been used up, there's no further entitlement that arises. But we do think that there will also be cases where what the employer wants to do is to discuss with the employee if there's a sensible way around this. So there may be cases where actually the employee can work, it's just they have to work from home. They can work, it's just they have to do some different hours, and a practical and pragmatic solution that everybody is agreeable to can be arrived at. But in the absence of that, then the contractual right to time off, if you have that under a carers policy, and then the statutory right to unpaid time off will apply. And as I say at the outset, we are going to see lots more of these cases over the next few months, because I'm sure autumn season, lots of kids with sniffles, what have you. We're going to see lots of cases where people will be saying they need to self-isolate.
Thanks, Richard. That's really helpful. So the next question we've received in from a customer is in relation to safer recruitment. And the question posed to us was, do we need to undertake a DBS for staff who've not been in school for over 3 months due to lockdown? It was a question we've received quite frequently, and Beth Alberger here, our Safer Recruitment Manager at EPM, I'm going to hand over to Beth to answer this question.
Thanks very much, Alex. So this is a very hot topic at the moment, and if staff have not been on site due to COVID, there's no requirement to recheck their DBS as they're still under a contract of employment, much the same as those who are on maternity leave and long-term sickness. However, in the terms of casual staff, the Department for Education state that they are not new employees and therefore they do not require a new DBS check. However, for those casual staff who have registered with the DBS update service, employers can check their status online with their permission. For all other schools and staff, you should risk assess to determine whether a new DBS check should be undertaken. This is because there's no set pattern to their employment, unlike those on temporary, fixed term or permanent contracts. You'll also need to consider your volunteers. So if your volunteer has a DBS check that includes a barred list check, that means they're engaged in regulated activity and they need to be doing that activity for 3 or more times in a 30-day period. If due to COVID that they've had a break in service, again, you'll need to risk assess whether or not it would be appropriate for a DBS to be rechecked. For those volunteers who are on, who have just got a basic enhanced DBS check without a barred list check, they're going to be appropriately supervised by someone who is engaged in regulated activity. So there's no requirement to redo their DBS check unless you've got cause for concern. So I hope that helps answer that particular question.
Thanks, Beth. I think that's a very clear answer. That's really helpful. Now, moving on to governance, the question which has been posed to us is, with the current COVID restrictions and the potential, obviously, for future lockdowns, which we know has already happened in some areas, governors aren't quite sure how they can undertake monitoring visits this term. What should they be monitoring, and how also can this be happening? So, Rachel from Avec, perhaps if I can hand this one over to you, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Rachel Kershaw. I'm Senior Governance and Academies Partner at Avec. Thank you very much for the question. I think the first thing to say is that it's really appropriate to think about the work that your senior leadership team are doing in schools, and to make sure that, although as a governor and your governor responsibility has been undertaken properly, you're not burdening them with the need that you feel that you want to be involved, and that you're looking at things appropriately and proportionately in terms of the involvement of governors during this time particularly. So in terms of governor monitoring, there is an awful lot that governors can still do, and a lot of questioning that can take place through your governing body meetings. Probably they're being held virtually, so you can consider, submitting questions potentially in advance for your senior leadership team to respond to at the governing body meeting, or asking them during the meeting as you would normally. I think you need to be really carefully scrutinising the reports and the information that's coming through from your senior leadership team and your head teacher, and making sure, particularly at this time, it's covering the level of information that you need to see as a governor to make sure that you're fully informed and fully briefed as well. You can also think about how you might be able to engage virtually with parents and the community. So is it appropriate to send questionnaires out, or to share some engagement with some of the wider community and those parent groups who particularly might be feeling unsure and nervous at this stage? So I do think there are areas that you can consider at this time. Some of the key things that it's important to monitor on and to look at making sure you're discussing in your governing bodies are about pupils returning to school, how their learning arrangements are being worked through, how pupil outcomes are being considered and reviewed this year, particularly because of the amount of time pupils have had out of school. So how is target setting working, and how are you really kind of looking at that workload that pupils are being given? Also looking at the remote working plans and making sure your school's ready to step into that remote working if and when it's needed, if the school has to close, which we're hoping not, but if year groups have to go home or groups of children have to go home. I think monitoring attendance and looking at attendance figures is really important. We're getting feedback that parents are nervous about sending their children to school. So how's attendance looking in your school at the moment, and is there a particular fluctuation? We've had schools where parents are potentially moving children to become elective home educated, and they might be more vulnerable pupils. So again, looking at that vulnerability of groups of pupils, how are those being monitored and being supported as well, and making sure they're not being forgotten about? The well-being of your staff and your pupils is really important. So I think making sure that there is details coming through to governors and to governing bodies about how staff are being looked after, the mental health of staff and pupils as well, and to make sure, you know, there is work and support in school to look after those particular groups. And then the other area I would say is budget monitoring. You know, there's an awful lot of change happening in schools at the moment, a lot of additional expenses and potentially some income that's not coming through. So you need to keep a really tight eye on budget monitoring and potentially adjusting your budget spend that you might have been planning to spend this year that might need to be adjusted and changed for different priorities.
Thank you, Rachel. Now, we've had a question come in, which, Richard, I think this is one for you, which follows up from the original question we had around pay and absence. The question is, I have an adult son that had to isolate. Surely if we do not agree to pay staff who are doing the right thing, they might not tell us their adult child is isolating. Would you mind taking this one, please, Richard?
Yeah, very happily. And look, I thought that was a really great observation from the person who raised that question, because I do think that we've got a real balance to strike with some of these policies. If you take a really hard line and you say we're not going to pay people, then they may not be honest, is the questionnaire indicates, as to their true circumstances. We may encourage people to attend work when they really shouldn't not be attending work. So there could be some challenges, I think, for employers if they take that hard line and they're saying we're not going to pay. Conversely, a very soft policy where we don't challenge and we don't have any situations where we might decline to pay, I think is likely to result in some cases where we struggle with people who've got repeated bouts of self-isolation, and there are bound to be some people who take advantage of that. We have had some guidance from the Local Government Association, who are saying that in most circumstances what we ought to be doing is to try and find an accommodation, and it's only if there's no reasonable solution in place that we ought to be considering periods of no work, no pay, in these difficult circumstances where somebody might have to not attend due to family members' illness or possible illness with COVID.
Thanks for that, Richard. I'm now going to move on to a health and safety question we've received. Should all students and teachers be wearing face coverings now? Now, we know there was a lot in the press about this at the beginning of September. Is there a difference as well between primary and secondary schools in relation to face coverings? Caroline from Southalls, if you don't mind me handing over to you, are you able to, could you answer this question, please? I think this is one for you.
Hopefully, yes, I'm here. So thank you for that. My name's Caroline. I'm obviously the school lead and safety consultant with Southalls, and this has been a fairly contentious issue actually over the last 24 hours as well, because Boris Johnson announced that in many of the retail environments that we should be wearing, if we're employed within them, we should be wearing face coverings. But at the moment, within schools, the government is not actually recommending the universal use of face coverings. There are, however, some slight exemptions in the fact that in areas of local lockdowns and restrictions, the expectation is that adults and students of Year 7 and above should wear face coverings when moving around in communal areas. So what I would recommend is that as part of your COVID-19 risk assessment, you might decide to implement the use of face coverings where social distancing is actually hard to maintain. You have the discretion within schools to require members of staff and visitors to wear these when moving around in your school. However, I must stress it shouldn't be at the cost of all of your other control measures. So where social distancing is possible, please still aim to do that. That is one of your major controls. So try and keep 2 meters apart, so between teaching staff, other staff and pupils. Within primary schools, which I think was part of the question, no child is expected to wear a face covering. But within secondary schools, you might decide that you want to bring in face coverings for students. Again, it might be in areas of the communal areas such as corridors, where you will find social distancing hard to achieve. And things like existing school layouts can really make that very difficult. So you can bring face coverings in there as well. But there is no requirement at the moment to wear face coverings within classrooms. This is because you do have other COVID secure measures that you should be putting in place, and it will be detrimental to your teaching. So use good hand hygiene, use good cleaning standards, and use your bubbles. So it is something that you can consider though within those communal spaces. Okay.
Many thanks for that, Caroline. Next question we've received is going to be directed at Helen here, from who joins us from Medigold. The question is around flu vaccination. Many people have asked, will a flu vaccination protect me from COVID? Helen, would you mind answering this one, please?
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Helen Vickers, I'm the Clinical Director at Medigold. First of all, before I answer that question, I just want to say well done to everyone, because this has been a complete nightmare for everyone involved, no matter where they are or what they do or what job they have. And we've had at Medigold ourselves really good discussions with lots of teaching heads and teachers about what the risks are when they've been confused about what's going on. So well done everyone, it's an absolute minefield and the goalposts move every single week, as we well know. Flu wise, the flu vaccination will not protect you from COVID itself, and obviously you've seen in the press that there have been lots of talk about a vaccination being available, and they're looking at, really all the trials are in pre-trial now, so you're kind of looking at a vaccination hopefully by December, January for COVID. Separately to this, obviously we're coming up to the winter season now, so if you are entitled to a flu vaccination because you have an underlying health condition or you fall into one of the groups that have a free vaccination from your GP, please go along and have it as soon as possible and book in now. The other issue with flu obviously is the stress and obviously the bigger workload it's going to put on the NHS this winter, and that's been in the press quite a lot recently. Obviously flu kills far more people than COVID has. So to get it into perspective, you do not want to be somebody who has complications from flu and end up in hospital with an overstretched already NHS staff. So I would say check if you can get a flu vaccination. If you can't and you want one, speak to your head of school and see what provision they have there, if there is any. And also remember that the government have widened the group for flu vaccinations this year. So now it's everyone who's over 50 and everyone who's in a household where they have a vulnerable person. So somebody who has been shielding or has underlying medical conditions, those people can get a free flu jab now. But it gives you that protection from flu. And also remember that you need to understand there are different kind of symptoms, although lots of them cross over, in relation to COVID symptoms and flu symptoms. So make sure you get some advice early on about your symptoms and whether you need to go and be tested, because that seems to be what's going on a lot with the testing at the moment, where we've had an inundation of people who have started, because the seasons are changing, started to get flu-like symptoms, which are not COVID, but then going along for a test. So that's caused a problem as well. So sorry, that's not the short answer.
I don't think many of these are, Helen. They are complex, aren't they? And there are so many different scenarios.
Absolutely.
So it is important that people are talking and asking questions relevant to their situation, because it's rare that it's a blanket one-size-fits-all approach.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Helen. Okay, so we now have a question about performance management for teaching staff this year, which I know many of you are concerned about, particularly when it comes to sort of union challenges, which we often see. What should be applied if there isn't valid evidence to judge this year? Because we know objectives would have been set last year, but actually it was prior to COVID and working from home and everything else that has brought with it. We're thinking particularly about teachers who have not progressed in recent years. Elaine, could I pass this one to you, please?
Thanks, Alex. Yes. Hello, everyone. My name's Elaine Hammond. I'm an Assistant Director for HR at EPM. And Alex, you're absolutely right. It's been quite a hot topic over the last few months, and our trade union colleagues excuse me, have actually challenged the need for performance management to be undertaken and have clearly pushed for pay progression to be a case that everyone goes through 100% of teachers irrespective of performance. In terms of performance management generally for teachers, I think you'll all agree that well-conducted appraisals can help to improve school-wide performance and increase employee engagement and motivation. And depending upon the current workload for your teachers and support staff, an appraisal may also be a good opportunity to promote employee self-development. And then through this, we will expect further training and possibly online courses could be arranged as the basis for future performance improvement. So for many, I would argue, and I think most of you would agree, that performance management is an opportunity to celebrate success for the individuals concerned. So I think in answer to whether appraisals and performance management processes should continue for teachers during this period, the simple answer is, well, yes. I think as line managers and employers would probably be doing the wrong thing if we weren't to continue with that. Specifically, Maintain schools have been notified by the Department for Education to continue to adhere to the school teachers pay and conditions document, which includes the requirement to ensure that all pay progression for teachers is linked to a successful performance management process. So whilst I recognise that that document, the school teachers pay and conditions document, is not a statutory document for academies/trusts, we would advise that you continue to follow your appraisal policy during this time. So schools will want to use their discretion and take pragmatic steps to adapt performance management during this difficult time, and appraisal arrangements might be different. You're going to be having to take account of these current circumstances, and for example, you might want to base performance on the period that schools were open as normal and adjust it if necessary. You might be looking at the expected trajectory had there been no school closures. So it's reasonable to expect if someone was on track to perform to meet their objectives, that they would have completed them if it weren't for the school closure periods. However, saying that, and I know the question was very much aimed about individuals who weren't necessarily performing prior to the school closure period. So if there's clear evidence an employee is not meeting objectives and they're unlikely to do so, then it is legitimate to consider the trajectory would be ongoing poor performance. Clearly, you're going to have some evidence of that, and hopefully you will have been speaking to the individual so there's no surprises for them. So it's important to make a note of these concerns in the performance management process. And I think if you were to allow pay progression for someone who wasn't meeting their objectives and where you'd had to share concerns, then it could undermine your position should you, in due course, decide it's appropriate to progress to a formal capability proceeding. So mixed messages, pay and formal capability procedures would be at odds with one another. So. Thank you.
Many thanks, Elaine. I know that's been a popular one that the advisory team have been receiving, so hopefully that's a helpful answer. So we've received a number of questions in around absence, particularly, and COVID. And just reviewing those, the first one is we've had some staff off with COVID symptoms more than once already this term. We're concerned that they may be taking advantage of the fact that these absences don't count towards absence triggers. Is there anything that we can do about that if we suspect that some staff are taking advantage? Now, Richard, would you mind taking that one? It seemed to be a hot topic.
Very happily, Alex. And I think it's interesting because it's the opposite side of the coin to the one that I was dealing with a few minutes ago, where somebody was concerned that if you don't pay people, then they won't reveal the fact that they need to isolate. Here's the other example, that if you pay people without question, then I'm sure there are going to be some people who take advantage of that. Now, I think that what you would be entitled to do is to discuss with the employee the fact that they've had a number of absences. You'd be able to point out that if they have used all of their entitlement to dependence leave within any policies you might have, that is now expired. And you would, I think, be entitled to say, unless we are able to find alternative arrangements that enable you to undertake some of your duties, subsequent absences, we're very sorry, are going to have to be unpaid because we have utilised all of the ammunition that we had to support you. But I think that's still going to be at the end of a process, and it will be a problematic position, because what you can't be doing is to say to staff, don't self-isolate because they have to. And what you can't be saying to staff is, you're not telling me the truth when you do this. So you would have to have a consistent policy that is based upon the amount of time the person is taking and the affordability of that, I think, to the school.
Absolutely, thanks Richard. Now we've got another one, a similar vein. If staff are off to look after their child who's awaiting a test, would they be applying their usual dependency leave, or is it unpaid leave?
Well, I think again, it's going to be dependency leave, whilst there is an entitlement to that. If entitlements are exhausted, then it could be unpaid leave, but subject to those same points about what's the message that you want to send, and are you going to discourage people from taking leave if you ought to, or encourage people to take leave when they shouldn't. In that case, while people are waiting specifically for a test, it's more likely to be the case that there is some degree of certainty as to that's why the employee is absent, and you may take a more benevolent view therefore.
Thank you. Actually, Richard, there seems to be lots that I can fire in your direction at the moment. Next question is, what should you do if staff refuse to look after a child with COVID symptoms? Yeah. That could be a good one for you as well.
Yeah, I'm very happy to take that as well, because to me, I know, again, I think this is a really fascinating question, because it tells us something also about what you need to have done to prepare for this situation. It is going to happen. There are going to be children who have COVID-like symptoms in school who need to be dealt with, because the list of symptoms is relatively broad and relatively vague. A child with a temperature, a child with a sore throat, a child with a cough. These are things that happen normally within a school setting. So schools are going to have to be prepared to be able to deal with these already. And so the risk assessments should be in place, and the staff training should be in place as to how to deal with this. Now, if we're in a particular circumstance where the employee refuses to undertake the duty, I suspect we have to just solve the problem there and then by getting the duty done. Somebody has to deal with that child and get them into an isolation room and get them into a position where they can be collected from school, and make sure that the social distancing is in place, and make sure that the PPE is being used and there's appropriate sanitising gels, etc., in place. If that happens, I don't think there's going to be time to address the employee concerned and take them through some sort of quasi-disciplinary, if you don't do this, you're going to be in trouble type process. I think it'll be a case of get the job done and then address the employee afterwards. And my addressing of that employee would be a re-education of this is our policy, this is our risk assessment, this is how we deal with these cases. This is why we have mitigated risks to staff in as much as we possibly can. But we also have duties towards the child and the safety of the child and the safeguarding of the child to ensure that they're properly looked after and supported in what might be difficult circumstances. And we expect you to play your part in that. I wouldn't be disciplining the employee, I think, on a first instance, but if it became a repeated issue, then it might be something that we need to look at under one procedure or another to ensure that that employee takes full part in the management of students within a school setting in the way that we expect of everybody else.
Many thanks, Richard. Now I'm going to jump back to Beth, because we've had a question come in around safeguarding and safer recruitment and interviews. Beth, the question that we've received is, what's the current guidance on face-to-face interviews, particularly for teachers? We know that the process ordinarily requires candidates to teach a lesson. What's happening in this area, please, at the moment to make it COVID safe?
Right. Well, obviously, face-to-face interviews is the preferable option, because obviously you are able to assess everybody equally under those in that environment. Obviously, due to COVID, you are still going to have to follow your guidance that you've got in place for schools to protect children and also adults there. But where possible, you should be doing interviews face to face now, and you need to think about how you are going to be using children, how you're going to do your teaching lesson observations and things like that to ensure safeguarding through this period of COVID that we're in. Whilst we were in massive lockdown, obviously face-to-face interviews weren't happening, but we were still recruiting, and you could use Zooms, Teams meets and things like that to carry out your interviews, and that worked quite successfully for everybody. But we're all back in school now, so we should be able to carry out interviews face-to-face, ensuring all the social distancing measures that you've been putting in place, and also be able to undertake lesson observations at the same time. So I hope that answers that question for you.
Thanks, Beth. That does. I'm sure it does. Okay, so going to move into finance area, and the next question is about the catch-up premium. The question posed to us is, can we spend our COVID catch-up premium on IT equipment for remote learning? Paula, would you mind handing over to you to answer this one, please?
Okay, of course. Thank you, Alex. Hi, I'm Paula Coxon. I'm a senior partner on the finance team at Avec. There isn't any rigid guidance from DfE unusually on how to spend the catch-up premium, so long as it funds the activities it needs to do to support pupils to catch up for the lost teaching time. They do, however, point schools towards some guidance issued by the Education Endowment Foundation, and that provides lots of examples of good practice. Now, included in there is a section on access to technology, and that goes on to say that some schools might find it helpful to invest in additional technology, either by providing pupils with devices or improving the facilities available in school. So the short answer is yes, you can spend it on IT, but I think it's important to remember that there will be scrutiny on how these funds are going to be spent. We know it's going to be included as part of Ofsted inspections in the future, and it must support your school's catch-up priorities. So our view is that it might be wise to treat this grant in a similar way that you already treat pupil premium in schools, just make sure there's a high degree of transparency. We'd recommend keeping governors and directors involved and up to date with the spending decisions and the evidence for these. So quite a lot of flexibility with this grant, but really just make sure you're well prepared for any future questions that you might get on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Now we have another health and safety question. I've heard that self-isolation for children should be 7 days, even if they test negative for COVID-19. Caroline, would you mind clarifying the position in regards to self-isolation? Who should attend school? Who should stay at home? And also for how long? Because it is a complex area and the number of days required has changed, I believe. So perhaps you could provide the up-to-date position on that.
I will, Alex. Thank you for that. So I suppose in basic terms, then, if a child displays symptoms of COVID-19, which are still the same, it's still that high temperature, persistent cough and the loss of taste or smell, they do need to be collected from the school to begin the self-isolation process. So the most important action then that can be taken is for them to then go and get a test if they can actually get hold of one. And if the test is negative and the child feels well, they can come back to school. So there isn't this 7-day period of time where they have to stay off school. So if it's negative and the child feels well, they can come back into school. If they can't get hold of this test, then they must self-isolate for 10 days since the start of those symptoms, and then they can return to school as long as no symptoms have commenced again. If they confirmed positive for COVID-19 as a result of having a test, they should self-isolate with their entire household. So that means that they won't be coming into school for a period of at least 10 days. And I must stress here that those 10 days start at the same time as the symptoms start, and then they can only return after at least 10 days or after that, as long as the fever has actually gone as well. You might find that children do come back still with coughs and a loss of taste or smell, because these symptoms can go on for a period of several weeks after they're no longer infectious. So hopefully that makes sense of it all. There is quite a lot of guidance on the government website, but essentially if they test positive, they stay off for 10 days from the start of their symptoms. And if they test negative and they are feeling well, they can come back into the school environment. That's it.
Many thanks, that's really helpful. Richard, I'm going to pass over to you a bit of a follow-up to that question that Caroline's helpfully answered. Can evidence be asked for from staff members for their test and the result? or if it's for a family member, a redacted version. Can you just confirm that this is the case and advise if there are any other steps that we can take if a staff member doesn't provide this information?
Yeah, it's a good question. It raises questions of general principle in terms of employees who seek to take absences, but it also raises, I think, the spectre of data protection and rights under the Data Protection Act and the GDPR regulation. So if I deal firstly, actually, with the family member position, seems to me that the issue with family members is probably this, that if the employee volunteers some information and it's redacted and you're happy to receive it and it's given in good faith, then you can probably do so. Because I think it's quite difficult to insist either that the employee provides it to you or indeed that you store that data, because that data is sensitive personal data. It relates to somebody who's not your employee, who hasn't as far as we know, given consent, and certainly not given informed consent for your storage of that data. So I think we have to be quite careful with family member data, and probably to be taking, in some cases, that on trust from the employee, if that's what they're telling us. If they can reveal something, we can see that helpful, but I think we struggle to insist that that must be done. In relation to the employee concerned, there are a couple of possibilities. So firstly, if an employee is self-certifying in the normal way, they don't have to produce medical evidence. If they're going to go beyond a period of self-certification, so over a week's absence, 7 calendar days absence, then you are entitled to see some medical evidence to support that. Now, that might be an isolation note that is generated by contact with the appropriate government service. It might be that if the employee is actually sick, that it becomes a fit note that you receive. But I do think that in those circumstances where an employee is going to be absent for more than a 7 calendar day period and they're saying that they are sick, they're entitled to see some evidence. If it's simply the case that the employee is isolating for that period, then I think you're also entitled to say, well, can you get an isolation note so that we've got something to support your evidence, to support your absence, other than simply your word.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. So now we have some non-COVID related questions. Would you be able to explain the calculation for prorating annual leave entitlements for part-time staff? Now, this is always a much loved one at EPM. It is a complex area, and I think Bev here is going to attempt to answer this one. How does it work, and with apportioning of bank holidays as well, is the question. Bev, would you mind taking this one, please?
I'd like to say with pleasure. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bev Priest and I'm Head of Payroll here at EPM. As Alex alluded to, this is a difficult area, raising questions around the application of the Working Time Regulations, but also the Equalities Act. Under Working Time Regulations, all workers are entitled to 5.6 weeks paid leave per annum. In the Harper Trust v Brazel 2019 Court of Appeal, the position was made clear that the Working Time Regulations make no provision for prorating statutory annual leave and that a week's pay was for a normal week's work. This contradicted what had been considered a practical and fair way to assess entitlement of paying, especially term time only workers, what is a prorated based upon weeks worked in the year. It has been identified that a pro rata calculation for short-serving staff can lead to them receiving a smaller proportion of holiday pay than full-time staff, which is a breach of the Equalities Act. Bank holidays for part-time staff are a particular problem, and generally it is a risk to have a policy of pay if they fall on a working day. It's much better to include in an overall package. So guidance is therefore to adopt a strategy to deal with this. Some of you may wish to wait to see if the Harper Trust Brazel decision is appealed to the Supreme Court before making any contractual changes. Others are in fact implementing change now. For instance, they are implementing pay uplift or temporary allowances. This is a fact and employer-specific decision which EPM will provide advice upon to customers or via consultancy.
Thank you, Bev. I know the team always look forward to receiving those questions. It's certainly an area that if you do have questions, your best is to contact your advisor directly at EPM. I agree entirely with that, Bev. Our next question that we've received is, are we able to carry any unspent PE and sports grants funds from last year to 2021 to use on other expenditure? Michelle, I'll hand this one over to you.
Thank you, Alex. I've actually got a quick answer for that one, and it's no. But the DfE have announced that you are allowed to carry over any underspent PE and sports grant expenditure into the next academic year, but it specifically has got to be spent on the provision of PE and sports in school. And it has also got to be spent by the 31st of March 2021. So that answers that. You're not allowed to spend it on other things. If you're an academy and you're working on your year end at the moment, you don't defer the income into next year, you just keep the funds in the current year, but you do have to show the reason for the underspend, and obviously given the current situation that there probably will be an underspend. It's also worth noting as well that the PE and sports grant hasn't been confirmed beyond 2021, so just to remember that there's no guarantee that that grant will be continued following then. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Our next question is, should I go into school if I live with someone who was shielding? Obviously, we had the clinically extremely vulnerable category, which is sort of no longer in place, but obviously there will be concerns, particularly in light of last night's announcements. Helen, would you mind taking this one?
Yes, that's opened a whole can of worms, hasn't it, really? So
Imagine.
as you probably all well know, the shielding stopped on the 1st of August, and now people who were shielding don't have to shield anymore. Obviously, it's a massive, massive hot topic, especially in occupational health. And I would say probably it's the thing we get questioned about most when people ring up and ask us, I've got a member of staff, they've got a child or an elderly relative or husband or partner who was shielding. I don't want to come into school and pick up COVID and take it home to them. And that's a really, that is a risk. But I think it's a bigger picture than that, and we have to kind of look at what's that individual's risk when they're in school. And Caroline's already answered the questions about PPE and about making sure we've done risk assessments and all of those things. So this is a lot about reassuring people. People get very, very jumpy about this kind of stuff, and I think because the government guidelines were not clear and they all go a little bit fuzzy, people are very panicked and anxious about this, and we've done a lot of calls with people individually where schools have put people through to us to speak to because they are concerned and they're anxious. So I think yes, you can go into school is the answer to the question, because nobody is now shielding, and you carry on following the rules that are already in place. So making sure, it's old-fashioned, I know, and I've been a nurse for a long time. Basically, wash your hands. Wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. Wear a mask if you need to, if the risk is there, and make sure you use hand sanitizer regularly, and make sure that the school you work for is put things in place for deep cleans, for extra cleaning, for all of those support mechanisms that need to be. And if you're concerned, speak to your line manager, speak to occupational health, ask them to speak to their GP or their specialist and get some more advice, because every person's case is individual, and I think sometimes you just need that extra bit of support, and they just need an extra bit of kind of reassurance in those situations. So if you have a question, just look for the right people to ask. There is a lot of information on the government website and the PHE website, and there is also a helpline. So if you want to ring, you can go through the DfE website, and there is specialist people that you can speak to. So if you have an issue and something's happened, or you need to just look at those kind of things, you can get some sensible advice from somebody. So ring them. It's a free service. Ring them up and speak to them.
Thanks, Helen. Now, actually, while you're on and the camera's on you, I'd like to ask you, there's been a question come in about vaccinations. Okay. Would you recommend that schools should pay for staff to be vaccinated to lessen the risk?
Ooh, controversial. Well, we all know how much money schools haven't got. I think it's quite a hard one, if I'm honest, to answer that question. I think if we are going forward and we have a vaccination and we find that it works and that's a sensible option to keep the school running smoothly, I would say vaccinate, if I was honest. But I think every school is individual. They know how much money they've got, but also what you need to kind of balance up is how many people are going to be repetitively off because they're either in a bubble or they've picked up symptoms or they need to be tested or they need to isolate because they have symptoms. You know, weigh that absence against the cost of a vaccination, which is probably, I would think, going to be in the region of maybe £20 to £30 at the most. I would say pay for the vaccinations because your school is going to run far more smoothly if you have that.
Thank you, Helen. That's a good answer. I think many would agree with that. Now, we've had some questions come in about performance management. Elaine, you picked up on those questions previously, so I'm going to fire these in your direction. Seems to be a hot topic, which we sort of anticipated. So the first one is for support staff performance management who started prior to March 20 and whose probations were halted during the shutdown and reinstated from September. With their policy, they would be eligible to an increment in September 20. Can they hold off delaying that until they've passed their probation? Oh, Elaine, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Yes, so we did provide some advice in terms of the probation in our guides and resources section of EPM about extending it and deferring that with agreement with the individual given the COVID situation. It very much depends on the contract, I'm afraid, because it may be that it's a contractual clause that states that the increment will apply, and it depends upon the link to the probationary period. So I think it's quite a hard one to answer without looking at specific cases and in specific templates of employment. It's possible, but I wouldn't want to say, yes, go ahead and do it, and then you end up being in breach of your contract.
So one, if they're an EPM customer, take advice from us, their advisor, or give us a call to do business consultancy. Okay, fabulous. The next question, again about performance management, is if a member of staff has typically been awarded accelerated pay in recent years, how do they assess that this year? Can a member of staff argue that they typically received accelerated pay and therefore should receive it again?
I think it's really important to note that, again, accelerated pay is not a contractual right, and it's an objective assessment based on the performance of the individual at a given point in time. And therefore, past performance, I would always say, doesn't warrant an assessment that future performance is going to be the same. So I think it's an unreasonable expectation for an individual to make such a request. If you've got clear evidence that they would meet the criteria for what your pay policy would normally provide accelerated progression for, then yes, you may wish to consider it, but it's not a given just because they've had it that they should receive it going forward.
Thanks. Elaine, I'm going to move on. We received a question prior to this, in advance of the run up to this session, around immigration, so I'm going to move on to that question. In general, what's our experience through the advisory team about Trust and MATs and what they're doing in relation to sponsorship? Are we seeing a pattern of MATs and Trust applying to become sponsors in light of the changes from January? What's the experience we're seeing at the moment, please?
Right, well, it's nice to actually have a question that's not COVID related, because in HR advisory we've had so many of them recently. And yes, Brexit's been in the news a bit more, hasn't it, recently, bar yesterday. So in July, the government, just to set some context, in July the government did set out further details on the UK points-based system, and just so everyone's on the same page, these new arrangements will take effect in January 2021, and that's once the freedom of movement with the EU has ended. So in effect, EU and non-EU citizens will be treated equally, and the aim is to attract people the new system aims to attract people who can contribute to the UK economy. So employers will require a sponsor licence before they can employ nationals from the EU in the post-Brexit immigration system. So that's the context. The specific question was about are trusts registering for sponsorship, and I have to say, myself and my colleagues who are working with a significant number of trusts across the country are not aware of a trend of MATs registering to be a sponsor. So whether to register very much depends on the profile of the existing workforce and really the recruitment strategy that you as an employer will have going forward. If you're recruiting from your local market or even further afield in the UK, then you may want to defer a decision on this in terms of registering for sponsorship. But if you do think you wish to register, what we are hearing at the moment is that it's probably worth starting the process now, even though it doesn't take effect for a few months, because the government has indicated that that process alone could take a few months to go through. And they have said they're anticipating quite a flurry of applications in the last few months of this year.
Thank you. Nice, like you say, to have something a little bit different from COVID, but I think we're going to move back into that area. We've had a couple of questions around health and safety. So Caroline, these ones are particularly for you. Following Caroline's advice about PPE and reassuring people and extra hygiene measures, does the same apply to pregnant teachers who need to be on site teaching, or should they be putting alternative measures into place?
Right, thank you, Alex, for that question. If I could just actually quickly go back to the one about vaccines as well, just to have a little quick chip in there to echo what Helen said. Absolutely, yes, look at vaccines as part of your control measures. You will find that if you decide that they are a control measure to protect your people at work, you are actually liable to pay for vaccinations. But what we're thinking is that actually, as soon as this vaccine becomes available, and hopefully it'll be part of the NHS immunisation programme, so it should probably be free to all anyway. But if it isn't, then you might be looking at that as a control measure within your school. So you will actually have to offer that to your teaching staff and your support staff. To go back to the actual question though, so pregnant teachers who need to be on site teaching, or should they alternative measures be in place? Well, this is actually all down to, again, the fatal words of risk assessment. So you would need to do an individual risk assessment. This is part of your new mothers and pregnant ladies risk assessment that you should be undertaking anyway. You would need to work your way through that and ensure that strict social distancing is possible. So you will need to ensure that 2 metre social distancing is possible between the pupil, between the pupil and the teacher, between the teacher and other members of staff. And that goes on until the 3rd trimester. And I know I've got a lot of HR colleagues on the call with me who might be able to prompt me if I go wrong. But that's as far as we understand it in the safety world, the occupational safety world, goes on to the 3rd trimester. And then at that point, you might need to look at alternative arrangements, which would include potentially working from home. But essentially, it is all about that strict social distancing and an individual risk assessment. OK, thanks, Alex.
Thank you. And before you disappear off, I think you're off the hook quite yet, Caroline. Question that we've received as well relating to health and safety and British standards for cleaning products. There's been talk about perhaps a change since COVID about what cleaning products should be used in school and the British standards required for that. Could you provide some clarity on that, please? Absolutely, I can. And actually, this is the kind of question that gets me going in health and safety, because I really do enjoy a British standard question. So to clarify then, BS 1276, that standard came about as a result of an E. coli outbreak, really, and applied to food businesses. You had to have something, a cleaning product that's actually conformed to that British standard, because it shows that it can effectively kill foodborne, food poisoning organisms. So it was particularly good at getting rid of E. coli. Now, we know from government advice that if you're cleaning in a non-healthcare setting and there's no confirmed cases of COVID, that you can carry on using your standard cleaning chemicals, and that would be one of them. And I'm presuming this might have come in from a school's catering environment. Yes, absolutely, carry on using that BS 1276 standard of sanitizer or detergent disinfectant.
However, you've asked about the other standard, which quickly I have to look on my other piece of paper there, I can't remember, is 14476. That's the virucidal standard. So that's telling you that you can kill off these enveloped viruses. So where you would apply that is you apply it where you have had a suspected case or an actual case of COVID-19. So that's where we go back to the government advice and we start thinking about what we can use as a cleaning product to kill COVID-19. So the government, and I'm having to read off my screen over here because I don't carry this information in my head, but the government is telling us that a combined detergent disinfectant solution at a dilution rate of 1,000 parts per million of available chlorine is what we need to be looking at. If you can't get hold of that and something like Milton can be diluted to that rate, you should look at a household detergent that hits that, so 1,000 parts per million of available chlorine, or you can look at something else that meets that BSEN 14476 standard. So I hope that helps. Yes, non-COVID, non-suspected COVID, you can go back with 1276 detergent, disinfectant, you're great. If you think you've got COVID, use that available chlorine and use that BS 14476 standard. Okay.
That was very impressive, Caroline. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Rachel, I'm going to move to you now. We received a question which is around governance. We are a small single academy trust, and our head teacher, bracket CEO, is a trustee and a member. Is this allowed?
Okay, so we do come across this quite a few times, particularly in small single academy trusts. DfE have always recommended that there's been a separation between the different levels of governance, so between members, trustees and any local governance arrangement. And that's to ensure that there is a good level of accountability between each of the levels of governance and each level can hold the next one to account. However, it has been possible to have the same people at different levels in the past. However, the Academy's financial handbook that's just come into effect on the 1st of September this year now confirms that members are not allowed to be employees of the school or allowed to be in unpaid staff roles within the school. So this doesn't come into effect for this particular requirement until the 1st of March 2021. But it is part of the Academy's financial handbook that is now live. So you do need to be looking at your structure for governance. You do need to be seeing if there's any crossover between those members, the trustees and people who are employed and working in that school. And if you've got members who are employed members of staff or working in unpaid roles of staff, then you do need to make some adjustments and some changes. And don't forget that, it's the rest of the members who would need to approve those changes. So you might need to do a resolution or some kind of arrangement that means you can get that member approval.
Fabulous. That's great stuff. Thanks, Rachel. Now, I'm very mindful of the time. We've got literally a few minutes left of this session, but I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple more questions. One around safeguarding, I think, and then one that we've received today. So, Beth, I've got a question for you. I'm recruiting a new trustee. Please, could you confirm if there are any specific checks I need to make apart from the DBS checks and management checks?
Thanks very much. Ooh.
Oh, Beth, you're on mute.
Am I unmuted now?
Perfect.
Excellent. Lovely. So as long as you've done your DBS check, which for governance is not regulated activity, so it's just an enhanced DBS check without a barred list check, and you've done your management check, there are no other checks that you need to do. Obviously, if the individual in the course of their DBS application has resided abroad, then you're going to need to make sure that you obtain the relevant certificate of good conduct from the relevant countries there, because they should undergo the same type of checks as anybody else. And you'll also want to, as part of the DBS checking process, make sure you've done an identity check on the individual. So those are the two basic things. You've got your DBS check, you've done your section 128 check to make sure they're not barred from being involved in the management of a school, and that's it.
It's very straightforward. You make it sound so simple, Beth. Last question, I think we can squeeze in is one we've had arrive in today. Elaine, probably one for you, I think. A staff member was signed off for 3 months, anxiety due to COVID. Now, that's quite I think we're receiving a lot of calls about anxieties and absences at the moment, so it's not unusual. The note ends on the 3rd of October. We've not had any contact from the staff, as she told us we were harassing her and led to her being signed off. How can we ask her to return to school? So what steps do they need to take to help get her back into the workplace without hopefully further accusations of harassment?
Okay, sorry, Alex, did you say the anxiety is COVID related, or?
Yes, it is indeed.
It is,
yeah.
Okay, all right. So yes, this is a common one that we have been receiving from customers of EPM, and clearly anxiety is a genuine belief that there is a concern, you know, in terms of being in the workplace, so we mustn't undermine that or question that side of things, but we do need to take some medical advice, and what we're often saying is that they might want to approach occupational health in terms of getting some information about the level of that anxiety, that side of things. And then we'd obviously have to look at that particular case. Clearly, in terms of the contact with the employee, it's really important that employees and the employers do maintain contact. It's very easy to slip into a position where contact is not being had between the parties, and that then becomes the norm. There's an implied, in nearly every single absence policy, the individual has an obligation as well as the employer to keep that contact going. Excuse me. So I think that needs to be told to the individual that we're not harassing, we obviously care and have a duty of care towards you, we need to understand what your concerns are, we may be in a position to actually get you back to work and have a look at what your anxiety is in relation to the specific points. The risk assessment should help. Is it because they haven't seen the risk assessments being followed out properly? Obviously senior leaders within the school can then seek to address those concerns. So, I mean, it very much is about communicating with that individual, making it clear it's not harassment, it's an expectation and a duty of care towards them. And hopefully with that communication, possibly with the support of occupational health, then we would hopefully aim to be able to get that individual back and that they're reassured that their employer really does care and has provided a COVID safe environment, or as near as damn it. Yeah.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. Right, we're now at 3:01, conscious of the time. I think that probably brings us to a close, in which case, so thank you all for your time today. Hope you found the session really valuable, and thank you for joining us. Of course, if you have any further questions or need any additional support, please reach out to us from any of the panel members or from your advisors at EPM. You can contact us in the usual ways through our mainline number 01480 431 993 or directly with your advisor. If you have questions which need directing towards Avec or Medigold, to the experts on the panel here who've joined us today, or Southalls and Caroline, then do drop us an email, send it to services@epm.co.uk, and we can always redirect it on and pass it on to Helen, Caroline or Rachel or Paula, or Michelle. So thank you all. Hope you found that session really valuable, and any feedback is always received. I think we found it really interesting to receive your questions and respond to them. There are some that I know have come through that we haven't had the opportunity to answer and respond to on this session, so we will pick those up following this session directly with you. Stay well and safe. Thank you for joining, and hope to hear from you very soon. Thank you.